Good afternoon. A very warm and slightly late welcome, despite the rather chilly weather this week in Norwich, to St Peter Mancroft Church, whether you're here in person or whether you're watching online. If you are in church, please feel free to continue your visit. My name's Catherine Waddams. I'm a licensed lay minister here, and today I'm leading our short weekly reflection. Last month, the chief economist at the Bank of England caused a furore by his descriptions of our current economic difficulties. He said in a podcast, "We're all worse off, and we all have to take our share." He was emphasizing that wage rises in response to increasing costs of living can just perpetuate a cycle of inflation. But he was seen as out of touch with reality for many in this cost of living challenge. A couple of weeks later, he acknowledged that he could have phrased things better, saying that both he and the Bank of England recognise that we live in very difficult and challenging times, and those challenges are particularly acute for some parts of society. So the question I want to ask is, should we all have to take our share of pain? It's certainly true that the economy is not growing much and that the cost of living crisis is very real. Here at St Peter Mancroft, a group has prepared a booklet about help and ideas to cope at an individual and household level, based on suggestions from the congregation and local information, as well as describing ways in which we might be able to help others. But as a society, should we all have to take our share of pain? It's relatively easy to let everyone have a little more when things are going well, on a rising tide of the economy. But what about taking the pain when the tide is falling and sacrifices do have to be made? Should we all be tightening our belts? We find it much more difficult to give up the things we have than to not take potential gains which we haven't yet experienced. It's called the endowment effect in economics. It was illustrated to economics students in an experiment which gave the students, half the students in a large class, a promotional mug with the university's logo on it. A bit like this one, I suppose, which I got from a conference at a German university. The students who had received the mug were asked how much they would be willing to sell it for. The students who had not received a mug were asked how much they would pay to buy one. Do you think the prices were about the same? It turned out not. There was a huge difference. On average, the students who owned the mug wanted almost twice as much for their trophy as the amount that those who didn't have one were willing to pay. Once people owned a mug, they became attached to it, felt it was worth more to them. It would be more to a wrench to give it up than they would have been prepared to pay before they even owned it. I have to say that this is one of my favourite mugs for my many cups of tea during the day. I'd be very sorry to give it up. This trivial example illustrates why it is so difficult to manage an economy when sacrifices are needed and belts do need to be tightened. This is particularly true for the people who Theresa May once called jams, the just about managing. A couple of years ago, many people were managing, just about able to make ends meet, with little left over for savings. We all know about the rising price of energy and of food and other essentials, which mean that they're struggling to avoid debt, which we know has risen sharply amongst households with lower incomes. Older people like me may point out that in absolute terms, most families have many more material things than, say, 50 years ago, when I started looking after a household budget, carefully recording all my expenditure as my mother had done before me, let alone if we look in longer historical perspective. But in those 50 years, almost all of us have got used to new things, from media and communications possibilities, which didn't exist then, to more variety in our leisure time and how we take our holidays. We've come to expect that each generation will be better off than their parents. We've got used to those improvements, and we've got fancier belts, I think, and let them out accordingly. Some of those novelties, like digital communication, have become virtually essential to participation in society, especially for negotiating the job market, benefits and health services, so their absence is effectively now called digital exclusion. But sacrificing things we have, even trivial promotional mugs, can be quite painful. So how should we negotiate a falling economic tide when there is less to go around? Who needs to tighten their belts? And how might our faith guide us in these difficult issues? Today the Church remembers the visit of Mary, newly expecting the birth of Jesus, to her older cousin Elizabeth, who was 6 months pregnant with John the Baptist. We're told that the child in her womb leapt for joy, and Elizabeth acknowledged how special Mary's child would be. Mary responded with a wonderful rephrasing of an Old Testament song, which we use in our own worship at Evensong, called the Magnificat. It tells of God overturning the established ways of the world, bringing down the powerful and lifting up the lowly and feeding the hungry. Can this help us as a blueprint for approaching sacrifice in difficult times? Whatever our political preferences, and whatever we think about the current distribution of wealth and income, Mary's song tells unambiguously of a God who favours those at the margins of any society, the lowly, the humble, the hungry. No qualms are expressed about depriving the rich and powerful here, scattering the proud in their own thoughts, bringing down the powerful from their thrones, sending the rich away with nothing. Even at this very general level, Mary's song shows God's strong preference for those who are struggling economically, just as her son Jesus' own message later focused on bringing good news for the poor, reinforcing much of the Old Testament's social teaching, which the original song reflected, protecting those who are struggling or just about managing. Surely we should be inspired to follow God's bias, to protect those who are particularly vulnerable to these changes, while recognizing that this means greater sacrifice for others. It is the proud, the powerful, the rich who should be tightening their belts. Jesus himself didn't mince his words about the difficulties for people who have many material things to enter the kingdom of heaven. We are told of the grief of a rich young man to respond to Jesus' suggestion that he sell his possessions and give the money to the poor. It's a tough ask for any of us who have more than enough, especially when we know that so many are struggling in our own society at the moment, let alone across the world, as climate change imposes new desolation and hardships in so many forms, from droughts to floods. Because of the endowment effect, which I talked about earlier, we've got rather used to our comforts, and sacrificing them can be painful, even if they seem trivial to others who have never experienced these relative luxuries. That's one reason why these discussions are so difficult, and why there was such an outcry at the chief economist's words, especially when it was pointed out that he earns £180,000 a year. So is there any good news for the rich in these circumstances? Mary's song and Jesus' own teaching make it very clear that owning material possessions can certainly get in the way of our relationship with God. But if we follow God's love for the marginalized, our influence and our material wealth can be used for good. Each of us can respond in our own way. We can express our support for such bias to the poor across society through discussion and through the ballot box, contributing at neighbourhood, at local, at national level, to debate about how these challenges should be met. It's sometimes difficult to do that without sounding rather shrill. But if we honestly want to be part of such a society which favours the marginalised, we need to find the courage to say so. On an individual basis, Jesus gives us a direct, if tough, challenge. How far are we able to follow his instructions to the rich young man, to sell our possessions, to give them to the poor? I certainly struggle to put this into practice in my own life, to go against that really strong endowment effect, to tighten my own belt by even a notch or two, to protect the most vulnerable. But I find both comfort and challenge in Mary's outburst, and particularly as it's phrased in the words of Timothy Dudley Smith's hymn, which is based on that Magnificat. It calls on us to reflect God's kingdom in our society and in our lives. And I'll just quote one verse of it. I won't sing it, you'll be relieved to hear. Tell out, my soul, the greatness of God's might. Powers and dominions lay their glory by. Proud hearts and stubborn wills are put to flight. The hungry fed, the humble lifted high.